It was Monday morning, and like clockwork, I packed my bags for the usual 2-day business trip. Every week, it was the same routine. 2 days away, 6 hours drive to the city, meetings, dinners with clients, a decent hotel bed, and the long drive back. Each time I left, Laura would stand at the doorway, leaning against the frame with that half smile she wore so naturally. There she was, just like every other week, her hair tucked behind her ear, fingers playing absently with the edge of her sweater. "See you Wednesday," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. I gave her a quick kiss, feeling that familiar pang that always came when I left her. But 2 days would fly by. I told myself I just needed to get through the drive. As the miles rolled under my tires, something gnawed at me, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Lately, coming home after my trips felt strange. The house wasn't as I'd left it, with signs that a small hurricane had swept through in my absence. Bottles left out, blankets on the floor, dishes stacked high in the sink. Laura had laughed it off, saying she got too lazy to clean when I wasn't around. I accepted her answer, though I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was amiss. Maybe I was overthinking it, turning into one of those guys who worried too much. But still, the uncertainty lingered. A few days ago, I'd even gone so far as to install a couple of discreet cameras around the house. A strange move, maybe, but I told myself I was just curious, just keeping an eye on things. Just a little paranoid, I supposed. By the time I pulled up to the hotel that night, the odd feeling hadn't left me. First thing I did was call Laura. The line rang and rang, but there was no answer. Maybe she was taking a bath, or had left her phone in another room. I dialed again, and again, nothing. I checked the time. It was just past 6. Usually, she'd be relaxing at home, maybe reading or watching one of her shows. It wasn't like her not to pick up, and I couldn't shake the strange sense of something hovering just out of reach. After a third try, I decided to check the camera app. I pulled it up, tapping through the screens of our empty house, scrolling from room to room. Then, the living room feed loaded, and my stomach dropped. The room was alive with movement. People everywhere, far more than I expected. Strangers filled every corner, laughing, dancing, drinking, taking over our home like it was some kind of club. In the middle of it all was Laura, a wine glass in hand, laughing and chatting, the spark in her eyes brighter than I'd seen in ages. She was passing around drinks, moving from person to person, her smile a little too big, her laughter loud even through the muffled mic. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. Was this real? This was our living room, but it looked like a scene from someone else's life. I watched as she moved across the room, her laugh ringing out as she leaned in close to a man I didn't recognize. He looked at her with that ease, that way of the kind of guy who didn't think twice about putting his hand on her back or laughing a little too loudly at her jokes. And Laura didn't stop him. I felt a pressure build in my chest, the kind that only comes when the world as you know it starts to twist. Why would she throw a party without telling me? Was this just a casual get-together, or something else? The question clawed at me, the memory of her seeing me off that morning replaying in my mind, her soft smile and gentle kiss. It didn't match up. This version of her, in our home, felt foreign. I watched, unable to look away, as people kept filing into our house. One after another, their faces blurred, strangers who had no idea I could see everything they were doing. I checked the time again. It was already 8, and I'd seen enough, but I couldn't tear myself from the screen. I kept the app open, even as I paced the room, trying to figure out what to make of it all. At one point, I called her again, hoping she'd answer, maybe even give me some sort of excuse that would put my mind at ease. But once more, the line went to voicemail. I left a message this time, my voice tight, carefully controlled. "Hey Laura, give me a call when you get this. Just wanted to hear from you." Hours crept by. It was after midnight by the time the crowd thinned. I watched people leave in pairs or small groups, holding each other up as they stumbled to the door. Finally, Laura reappeared, dropping onto the couch and leaning back with a dazed smile, her eyes reflecting the mess around her. She stayed there, her head resting on the back of the couch, her eyes half closed, a slight smile lingering on her face. I woke up to my phone vibrating on the nightstand, its screen glowing in the early morning dark. I squinted at the clock, 6 a.m. Who would call at this hour? Then I saw her name flash on the screen, Laura. I sat up, trying to shake the sleep from my mind as I answered. Hello. My voice was rough, barely a whisper, but before I could say more, I heard her speak. Hi. I'm sorry I didn't call you back yesterday, she said, her voice soft, almost cautious. I'm sorry for calling so early, too. I just thought you might be worried. I could feel my pulse quicken, a surge of anger rising. The memory of last night, her laugh echoing through our living room, her hand grazing the back of a stranger. That wild, carefree side of her I'd barely recognized. It all rushed back, but I swallowed it down, forcing my voice to stay calm. Laura, what were you doing? I tried to keep my tone even, but I couldn't mask the edge in my voice. I was worried. Why didn't you answer my calls? She paused, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd say something, an apology or some small confession. But instead, she just laughed, that familiar, breezy laugh. Oh, sorry, babe. I was just busy. I went to a friend's house, and, one glass of wine turned into a few, and I must have put my phone on silent. You know how it is? Friend's house? The lie was so casual, so effortless, like she'd practiced it 1,000 times. My stomach turned, the knot of anger growing tighter. Oh, right, I managed, forcing myself to sound neutral, like I hadn't seen every chaotic moment of the party that tore through our home. Well, I was just worried. Tried you a bunch of times? Yeah, she said, her voice lowering, almost apologetic, but not quite. I found it under a pile of clothes this morning and saw all your missed calls. I know I should have called earlier. I just didn't want you to worry. Each word felt like a careful step over a crack in thin ice. She hadn't mentioned the party, the crowd of strangers, the mess. Not a single word about what I'd watched from my hotel room, helpless as a ghost in my own home. My hands gripped the phone tight, but I managed a dry chuckle. No worries, I said, trying to match her casual tone. Guess I'll talk to you later. After I hung up, I sat there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd missed it for so long. She didn't sound guilty. She sounded relieved, like she'd just sidestepped a minor inconvenience. Not like she was talking to her husband she'd lied to, with barely a pause. The memories from last night ran in a loop, mocking me. Every detail played back as if they were daring me to admit the truth, but I stayed silent, holding everything back. I got up and showered, forcing myself through the motions, each step sharpening that growing ache. My mind playing scenes of her laugh, the way she'd leaned in close to that stranger, too close for a married woman, to someone she'd just met. I remembered the phone ringing unanswered while she tossed back drinks in the middle of a sea of people I didn't know, her face glowing with excitement. The images wouldn't leave. When I finally stepped out of the hotel, I dove into the day's meetings, the hours stretching and bending as I tried to focus. Every moment my mind drifted, I'd snap it back to work, but her voice still echoed in my head, that easy dismissal. I went to a friend's house. I must have put my phone on silent. I looked down at my phone throughout the day, willing myself to look at the camera app, to search for more proof. But each time, I put it back down, my chest heavy with a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something I wasn't quite ready to admit, fear. Fear of what I'd find if I kept watching. Fear of just how far the truth might stretch, of how much I hadn't been seeing. That night, I collapsed into bed, exhaustion finally overtaking the nagging thoughts that had clung to me all day. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the unasked questions pressing down. Why hadn't she mentioned the party? The hotel room was silent and dark, but my mind raced, replaying Laura's lie over and over, dissecting every small inflection in her voice. I'd spent the entire day with that single thought gnawing at me. Why hadn't she mentioned the party? She'd sounded so calm, so indifferent, like she'd been somewhere else entirely. Like the chaos I'd witnessed the night before was just another day for her. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the shadows flickering as headlights from passing cars traced along the walls. It was impossible to sleep, each blink of the alarm clock a painful reminder that I was hours away from answers. Still, my hand reached toward the nightstand, fingers grazing the smooth edge of my phone. Maybe she called again. Maybe there was something she'd forgotten to tell me. Or maybe I was just searching for a reason to find out more. Finally, my hand closed around the phone, and I unlocked it, my thumb hovering over the camera app. I opened the feed, my heart pounding as the image loaded, lighting up the room in harsh tones. The living room came into focus, and I immediately felt my stomach drop. The party had started up again, though it was smaller this time. The crowd was thinner, mostly strangers, each face blurred by the dim light. I watched as they moved around like they belonged there, lounging on our couch, drinks in hand, laughter spilling out as they talked over the thrum of music. The anger rose, sharp and hot, but I swallowed it, my gaze scanning every corner, searching for Laura. She wasn't there. I switched through the feeds, my hands growing cold as each room showed more signs of strangers and the unsettling remnants of last night's chaos. Bottles lined the counters, coats tossed onto chairs, people moving in and out like it was their own place. But no Laura. I took a shaky breath, willing myself to stay calm, telling myself there was an explanation, something that would make it all make sense. I switched to the bedroom camera. The screen loaded, and at first, all I saw was the dim shape of our bed, shadows stretching across the rumpled sheets. But as my eyes adjusted to the image, I saw her. Laura was there, lying in the middle of the bed, her clothes nowhere to be seen, her body curled up next to a man I had never seen before. He was dark-skinned, his hand resting firmly on her naked back, both of them tangled in the sheets as if they had been there for hours. Her face was turned toward him, her eyes half closed, her lips parted in a way I knew all too well. They were talking, laughing softly, their voices barely reaching me through the phone speaker. I felt something snap inside, a sensation so sudden and violent that it blinded me. My hand moved before my mind could catch up, hurling the phone at the wall with a force I didn't know I had. It shattered, the screen cracking in an instant, the room filling with the sound of glass hitting the carpet. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the scattered fragments, the realization crashing over me like a wave. The phone was dead. It wouldn't turn on. All of the anger, all of the pain, every emotion I kept tightly bottled up flooded out in that moment, spilling into the emptiness of the room. A scream ripped from my throat, something raw and primal, the sound echoing off the walls. I grabbed the bedside lamp and threw it against the wall, watching it shatter in a satisfying explosion of glass. My fists met the walls, the dresser, the table, as I tore through the room, leaving nothing untouched. My vision blurred with rage, the adrenaline pulsing so hard I could barely see straight. When there was nothing left to smash, I stood there, panting, surrounded by the debris of the destruction I'd wrought, my knuckles throbbing, blood trickling down from a cut on my hand. And yet, the anger still coursed through me, fierce and unyielding, refusing to die down. The image of her lying there, laughing with a stranger, was burned into my mind, seared in so deep it felt like it would never fade. I lay in the ruins of the hotel room, the shattered lamp and broken glass around me, staring at the wall in stunned silence. The images of what I'd seen on the bedroom camera played on repeat, sharp and clear, like something out of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The disbelief, the anger, it had burned so brightly, so fiercely, that it felt like my mind had scorched itself. Now, I was left with nothing but hollow emptiness. 30 minutes must have passed as I lay there, barely breathing, barely moving, the quiet settling over me like dust. And then reality crept in. I had thrown the only link I had to her, smashed the one piece of evidence, the last tether to the truth I'd watched unfold from afar. My phone lay in pieces on the floor, the screen shattered beyond repair, my impulsive rage having wiped away any chance of knowing what she was doing now, of seeing the betrayal I'd just witnessed. My stomach clenched, and I felt the weight of my mistake crash down on me. It was already past midnight, the silent room echoing my thoughts. I couldn't stay here, couldn't sit in this cold, sterile place while Laura lay in our bed, wrapped around another man. She was only a few hours away, but it felt like she was in another world, a world I wasn't welcome in. I grabbed my jacket, barely noticing the tremor in my hands, and headed for the door, leaving the mess of the room behind. No bag, no clothes, nothing but the searing need to get home and confront the truth in person. Outside, the chill bit into me, the silence pressing close as I climbed into the car, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I pulled onto the highway, the darkness stretching out ahead like an endless, unforgiving road. I pushed the gas pedal down, the car lurching forward, the needle climbing past the speed limit as I sped through the empty lanes. Normally, the drive took 6 hours, but I barely noticed as the numbers on the dashboard crept to 140 kilometers per hour. I would get there in 4 hours, maybe less. The broken phone taunted me from the passenger seat. I couldn't call her, couldn't ask her where she was, or tell her I was on my way. The last thing I'd seen was her lying there, laughing, comfortable in our bed with a stranger. The thought gnawed at me, twisting deeper with every passing mile. As I drove, the memories came in fragments. The day we moved into the house, laughing as we argued over where the furniture should go. The nights we'd spend in that very bedroom, talking about everything and nothing until we drifted off to sleep. That bed had been ours, a space that had belonged to no one but us. The idea that she could let someone else into it, the realization that she had willingly invited someone into the most intimate part of our lives, burned like acid in my chest. The hours slipped by in a haze, the world outside a blur. I barely noticed the familiar landmarks as I approached the outskirts of our neighborhood. Every light in our street was off, the stillness of the early morning hour, settling over everything like a thick fog. I slowed as I reached our house, easing the car to a stop just down the road. It was 4:30 in the morning, and the darkness around our home was absolute. No lights on, no movement, no sign of life, and no cars. I sat there for a moment, staring at the silent house, trying to make sense of the strange emptiness that greeted me. The memories from last night, the sounds of laughter, the blurred faces in the living room, they felt surreal in the quiet of the morning. Now all I had was silence and shadows. I stepped out of the car, the icy air cutting through me as I approached the house. Every step felt heavier than the last, each one bringing me closer to the truth that had shattered everything I'd thought I'd known. I gripped the door handle, bracing myself, and slowly opened the door. The house was eerily silent when I stepped inside. The faint smell of spilled alcohol and smoke lingered in the air, and as I walked further, I saw the remnants of last night's chaos scattered everywhere. Bottles littered the floor, overturned glasses on the tables, and the couch cushions were tossed around like someone had forgotten they were supposed to belong there. I moved slowly, trying to process it all. My heart pounded with each step, knowing that in just moments, I'd be face to face with the truth. I turned down the hall toward the bedroom, barely able to keep my hands from trembling as I reached for the door. I pushed it open, and there they were. Laura was lying in our bed, her body barely covered by a twisted sheet, her eyes half closed as she lay nestled against a man I'd never seen before, a dark-skinned man who looked up, frozen, the shock clear in his expression as he met my gaze. His arm was draped around her, his posture all too comfortable, as though he belonged there. The fury I'd held down since last night finally boiled over, and I felt my voice erupt from deep inside me. "So this is what you do when I'm not home," I shouted, my voice trembling with anger. The man jolted upright, his eyes wide with panic. He didn't wait for an explanation, didn't stop to make excuses. He just shot out of bed, grabbing his clothes in a frenzy as Laura gasped and stumbled back, her face pale. Without a word, he bolted for the window, throwing it open and scrambling out, disappearing into the early morning darkness before I could blink. Our bedroom was on the first floor, and he landed with a thud before he took off running down the street. I barely registered his escape. My eyes were fixed on Laura, who sat there still wrapped in the sheets, her face frozen in shock, her lips trembling. She looked at me with wide, teary eyes, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, as though she were struggling to find the words. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as tears began streaming down her face. She grabbed for her clothes, pulling them on with shaky hands. Please forgive me. I was bored when you were gone. I started having parties. I didn't think it would go this far. Her voice was thick with desperation, her eyes pleading as she took a shaky step toward me, her hands reaching out. This is what you just saw. It just happened. I didn't plan it. I was drunk. The words felt hollow, each excuse twisting the knife deeper. I took a step back, staring at her, the betrayal in her eyes as fresh and raw as it had been in my mind since I'd first seen her on the screen. You think that's supposed to make this better? I snapped, my voice shaking. Do you realize what you've done? You've ruined everything, Laura. Everything. Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth, her eyes red and filled with regret. She tried to reach out, but I stepped back, my fists clenched, the anger barely contained. Go pack your things, I said, my voice low and steady, each word burning as it left my lips. And get out. I don't want to see you in this house again. You destroyed our life. Do you understand that? She opened her mouth to say something, but the words seemed to die in her throat. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she stumbled back toward the closet, pulling out a bag. The silence stretched between us, every second only amplifying the weight of what had happened. She packed quickly, her sobs barely audible as she stuffed her things into the bag, her face downcast, never daring to look me in the eye. When she finally reached the door, she turned, her lips parting as if to say one last thing, but I didn't wait to hear it. I looked away, unable to bear the sight of her. She slipped out without another word, the door clicking shut behind her. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, my chest aching with a pain I couldn't put into words. I walked back into the living room, looking around at the mess she'd left behind, the remnants of the life we'd built together scattered like debris. And for the first time, I felt the weight of it all hit me. I sank onto the couch, my face in my hands, and the anger finally gave way to grief, to the raw, aching emptiness that her betrayal had left behind. I sat there, surrounded by the ruins of our home, feeling as if the ground beneath me had shattered, leaving nothing but the memory of the life I'd thought I'd known. The house was silent, heavy with a stillness that made every creak of the floor and whisper of wind outside feel like a taunt. I barely moved from the couch, sitting in the same place I'd sunk into the night Laura left. The wreckage of the party lingered around me. Empty bottles, half-eaten food, and piles of discarded clothes strewn across the floor like remnants of a life that felt alien now. I started drinking the next day, pouring myself a glass that quickly turned into another, and then another. The liquor dulled the edges of the pain, numbing me to the weight that pressed on my chest each time I remembered her in our bed, smiling, laughing, acting as if she had no husband at all. Each time she called, I let the phone ring out. I didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want her explanations or her apologies. I could feel the weight of her betrayal every time I took a breath, like a splinter embedded deep beneath my skin. She tried coming to the door, knocking and pleading, calling out for me to open up, saying we could talk. I stayed silent. I couldn't look her in the eye, couldn't bear to see her face twisted in a mask of guilt, of apology. What would words even do now? The days blurred together, each one a replica of the last. I'd wake up, pour myself a drink, and sink back into the same spot, surrounded by the debris of the life I'd thought we'd shared. I didn't clean. I didn't eat much. It was as though keeping everything exactly as it was could somehow hold back time, could keep me from facing the reality I was trapped in. Her laughter echoed in my head each night, taunting me in the dark. And each morning, I was met with the same gut-wrenching feeling of waking up to an empty home, a life that had become a hollow shell. One night, I heard a knock at the door. It was past midnight, and I assumed it was Laura, trying again to push her way back into my life. I ignored it, even as the knocking grew louder and more insistent, until finally it faded away into the silence. The next morning, I found out who it had been. 2 officers stood at my door, their faces a mix of concern and professionalism. Apparently, my neighbors had called, worried by the state they'd seen me in over the past week. They'd noticed the unkempt lawn, the lights left on at odd hours, and the disheveled figure I'd become, aimlessly wandering the house in the dead of night. I didn't remember much of what I'd said to the officers, only that I'd felt the weight of my grief pressed down harder, dragging me to my knees. Before I knew it, I was standing there, shaking, the tears streaming down my face in front of two strangers who looked at me with a sympathy I hadn't felt in days. They didn't ask many questions, didn't pry. They simply nodded, understanding something I couldn't put into words. I was too ashamed to meet their eyes, but one of them put a hand on my shoulder, steady and reassuring, a simple act of kindness I hadn't expected. They asked if there was anyone I could call, but I shook my head, feeling emptier than ever. When they left, I collapsed back onto the couch, the memory of their faces lingering as I drifted into a fitful sleep, the comfort of human contact echoing in the silence. The next day, there was a knock at the door again, and when I opened it, I was surprised to see my neighbors, a couple who had always exchanged polite greetings with me, but whom I barely knew beyond that. They stood there, a gentle kindness in their eyes as they asked if they could come in. I nodded, unsure of what else to do, and they sat with me in the mess of my living room, a quiet understanding between us. The husband spoke first, his voice calm and steady. He told me they'd noticed I'd been going through something, that they understood I was in pain. He didn't pry, didn't ask for details, but instead offered simple words of support, sharing his own story of loss, of a time when he had felt his life fall apart. His wife nodded beside him, offering me a small, understanding smile. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "We've all felt broken at some point, and you don't have to keep this all to yourself." They didn't say much more, but they stayed with me for a while, their presence a small balm against the gaping wound Laura had left. Before they left, the husband put a hand on my shoulder, his gaze steady. "Take it one day at a time," he said, his voice a quiet strength. "It won't be easy, but you'll get through this. And we're here if you need us." As they left, I sat there, their words echoing in the stillness of the house. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than despair, a faint reminder that I wasn't entirely alone in the world, that there were people who cared, even if I didn't understand why. The morning after my neighbors came to visit, I sat on the edge of the couch, gazing at the chaos around me. Bottles littered the floor, stained cushions and half-eaten food surrounded me, a vivid picture of the mess I'd let my life become. The words of my neighbors lingered in my mind, steady and calm. "You're not alone in this." That simple phrase settled in my chest, slowly dislodging something heavy I hadn't realized was there. Maybe it was time to start letting go. I stood up, feeling the fog lift just enough for me to take that first step. I gathered the bottles, the clothes strewn about, and scrubbed away the remnants of the life Laura and I had built together. Each sweep of the broom, each wiped surface felt like another layer of pain peeling back, and by the time the sun was setting, the house looked more like the home it once was, and for the first time in weeks I felt a small spark of relief. But I knew it wasn't enough to stay here. This house held too many memories, too many shadows. Within days, I made the decision to leave. I found a buyer quickly, the market was good, and people snapped up homes in our neighborhood fast. A small mountain village caught my eye, a place I'd visited on vacations years ago. It was remote, beautiful, and offered the chance to start over, far away from everything. I sold the house, packed my belongings, and within a week, I was driving up winding roads to a new life in the mountains. The village was like something out of a storybook, nestled among forests and valleys, with crisp air and skies that stretched out endlessly. I found a small, sturdy home on the edge of town, its worn wooden beams and stone walls promising quiet and solitude. There was land, too, enough for a small flock of sheep and a vegetable patch, enough to keep me busy and remind me of simpler things. The first month was hard. I stumbled through learning to care for sheep, managing my land, and sourcing my own food. Each challenge was a reminder that I was building something for myself now, piece by piece, without the weight of the past on my shoulders. Gradually, I found a rhythm in the work and with it a new sense of peace. I hunted when I needed to, foraged through the forest, and learned to take pride in the routines that filled my days. Each sunrise and sunset became a small gift, a sign that I was moving forward. 2 months passed, and the pain of Laura's betrayal was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. One day, I decided to return to the town and visit the neighbors who had reached out to me during my darkest days. I wanted to thank them, to share the peace I'd found. They welcomed me warmly, surprised to see me after so months. I came to them with a lot of hair, as I had changed a lot in these 2 months. They told me, so we sat in their cozy living room, and as I shared stories of my life in the mountains, they listened with interest, nodding and smiling. The husband clapped me on the back, congratulating me on finding a way to rebuild, and his wife beamed with pride, telling me how happy she was to see me doing well. But as the evening wore on, they hesitated, glancing at each other as though there was something more they wanted to say. "Have you heard about Laura?" the wife asked gently, watching my reaction. I shook my head, surprised to feel a twinge of curiosity, and maybe even something like regret. She continued, her tone soft. "She's moved on, I suppose. She found herself a wealthy man, someone who can give her the luxury she always wanted." Her eyes met mine with a touch of sadness. "She lives in a large home now, with a child, though, well, nobody really knows who the father is." I felt the news hit me with an odd, hollow feeling. The life I'd shared with Laura felt like a distant memory, and yet, hearing about her moving on stirred something painful, something raw and sharp. I wasn't sure if it was envy or bitterness, but I felt it flare up briefly, a reminder of the life that could have been. But just as quickly as it came, the feeling faded. I thought of the peace I'd found in the mountains, the quiet solitude of the life I'd built for myself. Laura's choices were hers to live with now, and the life I'd carved out had no room for the chaos she'd brought into mine. The husband patted my shoulder, as if understanding the swirl of emotions he saw on my face. As the night wore on, I listened to the sounds of the town outside, people coming and going, the faint hum of conversations drifting in through the window. The stillness I'd found in the mountains was powerful, but a part of me missed this, missed the company, the sense of community and connection I'd found here. When I left their home that night, I didn't drive back to the mountains. Instead, I walked through the streets, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the path ahead. An idea began to form, one that sparked a fire inside me I hadn't felt in months. The calm life in the mountains had given me the chance to heal, to find myself again. But I wanted more. I wanted to build something, to push myself toward a future filled with ambition and purpose. I made a promise to myself that night. I would start over, not as a man defined by betrayal, but as someone with the strength to rebuild. I would stay here in this town, surrounded by people who had shown me kindness, and I'd build a new life. I had ideas, dreams that had once seemed impossible. And now, the spark was back, stronger than ever. I'd start a company, create something with my own hands. I'd build something lasting, something that could carry me forward. And as I walked through the quiet streets, I felt hope rise in me for the first time in a long time, the past finally falling away like dust in the wind. The future was waiting, and for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. Hello everyone again. I'm writing this now on November 1st. I want to add to this story. It's been a year since this betrayal. I started a small company that now employs 10 people. I earn $2,000 a month from it, but I invest this money back into this company for its growth. My business is only going uphill now, and I want to say that everything that is done for good. My wife is living a luxurious life now, but she has a lot of problems. As far as I know, she is going to be convicted of fraud. I don't know what happened to her, but she is going through a hard time. Thank you for listening to this story.